Hello everyone and welcome back. I hope you're doing all right this week and getting settled into remote learning mode. I hope spring is arriving wherever you are. It's actually a really nice spring day here. So we're on to day 3 of our stream discussion. Now you understand a little bit about processing length. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how humans degrade streams and then how we try to restore them. So first a couple thoughts about how humans alter streams. So here is a landscape view of a stream area in floodplain. And so this is what streams usually do. They meander, they move back and forth across this valley over time, sometimes over many decades or centuries. And usually this is not a good situation for humans for a couple of reasons. One is because we build cities and roads and bridges and houses along these rivers, and we really don't like them to move very much. So that's one issue, is that we often feel like we need to keep these rivers from meandering. The other thing we tend to do is we try to plant crops and things like that in these floodplains. Floodplains are a good place to grow crops, but then they flood, they get too much water, and we can't grow crops. So we put in tile drains, which are ditches or subsurface pipes that are designed to get the water off the land and get it to the river as quickly as possible. This causes some problems. Here's just a little picture showing you a tile drained system. Maybe this is a farm, and you can see the subsurface tile drains here, pipes that have been buried under the soil, a few feet usually. And their job is to get the water that trickles down through the soil after rain immediately to a drainage pipe. Here it is, and get it to the river. And you see in this case they've channelized the river too by straightening the banks. This gets the water moving along as quickly as possible. It sends it downstream so that it's someone else's problem to deal with. So this makes farming more possible and more productive, but you can see what it does to the river. It prevents it from meandering, and it also makes it very flashy. We say a flashy stream is one that gets a whole lot more water after a rainfall than it normally would, because all this tile drain is draining all the land very, very quickly into the river. So this water, before humans came along, might have taken many days or weeks to slowly move through the groundwater and eventually get to the stream. But since we put in this tile drain, it might all get to the river in 10 minutes or so. So we get these streams that are really flashy. They flood, and then they're back to base flow. And then the next time it rains, they flood like crazy, and then they're back to base flow. This causes a lot of erosion along the banks. We humans also alter streams by disconnecting them from the floodplain, the riparian corridor, and sometimes even from the hyporheic zone. So we tend to like to build or farm right down to the edge of the stream, and then we build flood walls along the stream. So we're effectively removing the stream from the riparian corridor and preventing that flood exchange that we talked about last time, that lateral exchange of material and organisms and energy and water. Sometimes we even line the sides or the bottom of the stream with rock or even cement. I'll show you in a few minutes. And we do this to make the water more laminar flow so that it flows more quickly and gets the water out of our way almost immediately, and there's no turbulent flow. And that's true for humans. That means less flooding for us, but it also takes away any sort of habitat that organisms had, those pools and riffles that we talked about. So humans are pretty good at screwing up streams, unfortunately. So we cause a lot of problems. So flashy streams, bank erosion, channelization, loss of morphological features, that's like riffles and runs and pools, loss of the riparian corridor, disconnection from the riparian corridor. Here are some ways we try to deal with this. So we do bank stabilization, channel reconfiguration, habitat restoration, and riparian corridor restoration. So I'll show you some pictures of all of these here today. So here's bank stabilization. So here is a person walking next to a riverbank that's pretty clearly eroding. And probably because this river, wherever this river is, I guess it's in Michigan, where I stole this picture from, probably this river is very flashy. That means that right now it's fairly low, but whenever there's a rain, all the drainage tile is going to dump way more water into it than usual, and the river level might be way up here, and it's eroding away at this bank and undercutting some of the trees. So this is a problem because of the way we drain water off of the landscape. What do we do about it? You would think maybe we could stop draining so much water, or maybe we could restore some wetlands in the landscape to hold on to that water, but that's typically not what we do. typically what we do is we feel like we have to stabilize the banks, and we often do that with piles of rock that are called riprap. So this you've probably seen before if you've paid attention to streams, are chunks of a rock that are about the size of a softball that are piled alongside a bank that are pretty heavy, and the water of the stream can't usually move them, so it holds that stream bank in place. And so here's a bank down here that's been entirely riprapped, and then they put what are called barbs out into the water, which are piles of riprap that slow down the current and keep the current from eroding away at the bank. So from an engineering perspective, this works pretty well. It prevents bank erosion, and it keeps the river in place, but it also, you can probably see, prevents meandering, and it also is a terrible place for things to live. Almost nothing can live in a pile of riprap. Over here, we still have some habitat, maybe, but here we've pretty much taken away all the habitat and we've replaced it with big piles of rocks. So riprap is basically not very good habitat. Here's the next level up. These are called gabions. This is where you have a very severely eroded bankside, and riprap, just a pile of rocks, would not be enough. So this is a pile of rocks that have been wrapped in chicken wire, basically, to create this sort of stair step, basically a wall, a flood wall, to keep the river in place. This is also zero habitat. Nothing can live there. Its only purpose is to keep the bank from eroding further. In some really severe cases, they do what's called hard armoring. Here's the picture of that. They diverted the stream temporarily, and they're laying down sheets of concrete to keep that stream in place. So, engineers sometimes like these procedures because they do their job. They are going to last for many years and they keep erosion from happening, but biologists don't like them too much because they're awful habitat and they don't allow the stream to meander the way it has for hundreds of years. There are some kinder, gentler ways that have been proposed to do this, to stabilize a bank with CWD. That stands for coarse woody debris. So the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, does some of this work. And here they are anchoring logs, what are called biologs, in an undercut bank. So this is the idea of using not chunks of rock, but actually trees or branches or trunks, anchoring them in the bank to try to prevent erosion. So you get a situation like this. These are called biologs here, and they've sort of anchored those in with metal spikes to keep them in place. This works more or less, but they don't last as long because these are going to decompose. They do create some habitat underneath the water surface, but they don't last as long, and they're not as reliable as riprap. Here's another bio-friendly approach called fascines. Fascines are bundles of sticks that get buried in the bank. So here you can see maybe a bank that would be eroded, and they're burying bundles of sticks, sometimes even live cuttings in the soil there, so that the sticks help keep soil in place, but then actually some of those will actually sprout and grow and create kind of a living wall that creates some habitat, but it also helps to hold the soil in place. If you were all with me now, we would take a field trip and go out to look around the county at some ways we've tried to stabilize banks here in Licking County. And mostly it hasn't been fascines and biologs. Mostly it's been riprap and hard armoring, unfortunately. Okay, so another thing we tend to do, we humans, is channelize streams. We're going to hear from Charlie about the Kissimmee River. That's one of the longest channelized rivers in the world, unfortunately. And so we turn a stream that formerly meandered through the landscape like this, as we saw, into something that looks like this. It's a canal, basically. It's long and straight and does not have any ability to meander across the landscape. Why do we do this? Because the water flow through a meander is slow, and it's messy, and it floods its banks sometimes, although that's natural. This sort of flow is much quicker and much more laminar. It gets the water out of the way more quickly. So here are some pictures of meander streams and braided streams. So over time, over decades or centuries, streams will meander through the landscape, and they will actually create some backwaters and channels as they meander. Here's a place where a little oxbow lake has been cut off from the main stream, and that is really interesting habitat. That's good habitat for amphibians and insects and all sorts of organisms. So meandered streams are actually creators of habitat. What happens over time is that the energy of the stream bites into this bank as it's flowing through. And then over time, it will actually cut through and meet itself over here and create this backwater or oxbow lake over here. This is a braided stream in steeper landscapes or landscapes that have more coarse sediment. Sometimes you get a braided stream, which just means you have a bunch of parallel channels and it doesn't really create these cut-off oxbow lakes or backwaters in the same way. But it's the same idea. You got a lot of, you have the main channels and then you have some backwater channels that are not always flowing, and those create really interesting habitat also. There's a website called coolgeography.com. If you're bored, you can take a look at this. This is a river in the UK that has meandered so much, I can't even tell you where's the main channel anymore. But it's this whole landscape of meanders and backwaters and scrolls and oxbow lakes that are just really great habitat for lots of organisms. Really messy though if you had your farm or your house or your school here or a road here, because you can't have rivers moving all over the place like this. When we tend to build bridges over rivers, then we need that river to stay put, right? We can't be moving that bridge every few years. So as soon as humans start to develop an area, the meandering goes away and we try to keep that river channelized, but we lose out on this amazing landscape of a meandered stream. Channelization is ugly and it looks like this. So, here's a concrete, hard armored wall. We turn that stream into, that might have looked like this up here. We turned it into something really ugly that is like a concrete channel with very little habitat. You can imagine that in a channelized stream, the processing length goes way up because there's no organisms there. There's nothing to chew up the leaves and poop them out, nothing to process them. So detritus falls into the river and it might flow the whole length of the river without ever getting processed at all. Here's an area called Bassett Creek in Minnesota, related to Charlie. I don't know. Charlie, is this your family's land or anything like that? Do you know where this is? I just found this online, and it's an example of, yes, it's a meander, I suppose, but look, it's been riprapped in. So all this riprap along the sides is not allowing that river to move anymore. So once you start looking for riprap, you see it all over the place because we humans like our rivers to stay put for the most part. There are some efforts to do re-meandering, that is to put wiggles back into streams and allow them. So here's a stream in California that had been channelized, and then they put back in some modest meanders so that it could wiggle back and forth through this landscape. So sometimes you hear about re-meandering. The Kissimmee River that Charlie will tell us about has had some re-meandering efforts. In-stream habitat restoration. So in some areas, here's a stream in Illinois that's been obviously straightened and channelized. Some people do work to try to put habitat back into that stream. And sometimes that means adding gravel beds and riffles. So in this is a picture from Washington, but they added a bunch of gravel to try to rebuild some riffles, because when you channelize a stream, it all becomes one uniform depth and you don't have the riffles and runs and pools like you did before. It's all uniform. Streams aren't really, they don't really work that way. They're far more diversity when they have a variety of habitat. In this one, they've also added, I don't know if you can see it way back in this part of the photo, some coarse woody debris. So some big branches and trunks, some root wads, some organic matter. And again, that just creates some habitat. Also makes it more interesting to look at. Here's another area where they've intentionally put in a log jam in this river that had been cleaned of all the log jams, and that creates some habitat. It creates some interesting currents, some pools behind it, and some riffles downstream from it. So they're trying to put habitat back into streams. This is hard work. It would be way better to not take out these features to begin with. We don't always do that. Here is a major project in North Carolina I found online where they actually diverted the stream that had been channelized in order to put back in some changes in elevation, some riffles. You see the gravel bed here and some rock, just to sort of rebuild some habitat. Finally, riparian corridor restoration. So all too often we farm right up to or build right up to the edge of a stream. So here's an area where the riparian corridor has been converted into a farm, and you can see how it's eroding. This is a river in Minnesota that I happen to know pretty well. I used to live near the Redwood River in Minnesota. And unfortunately here, parts of it were eroding, and so you guessed it, they did riprap around it, and you can see nothing living there. And right next to it is a cornfield. So this is kind of the worst situation a bad way to treat a river. In a lot of areas, we've protected the riparian corridor, but it's a very narrow strip, maybe one tree wide along a stream on either side, or sometimes just on one side. There's not much of it on this side. And that's not very much. It would be nice to have 400, 500, 600 feet of riparian corridor protected for habitat, and then when the river floods, that area is part of the habitat. Here's a GIS picture of using a buffer technique in GIS to basically draw a few hundred feet around a stream to say, here's an area of riparian corridor that should be protected, and then let's go see if that habitat is protected. In this picture, in the bottom right, is an area that actually has a decent amount of riparian corridor protection. So in some areas, this means buying land and putting it back into forest, or actually paying farmers to not farm land that's in floodplain to put it back into riparian corridor. Okay, a quick case study. This is a stream called Jude Creek in northern Minnesota. This is highlighted in Chapter 9 of the Protected Land book, by the way. Unfortunately, this stream has the history of a lot of streams in the Midwest. It is heavy agriculture land, 70% agriculture. And back in the 1800s, starting in 1829, it was channelized and dredged, and farming went right up to the edge of the stream. Basically, it became a big ditch. That was just to get water off the land. All the habitat was really removed. So they called it a state ditch. Isn't that lovely? And here's some old maps just showing you how they straightened it, and its job was just to convey water. That's it. There were no meanders, no habitat, no riparian corridor. So a group from Notre Dame got together and got some funding to re-meander this stream. First of all, they took some data on it going back to the 1970s. And you can see the fish and invertebrates they measured just pretty much dropped off the table. There's just nothing living in this stream because there was no habitat. So here's their re-meandering project. They put in two areas, R1 and R2, that are, R stands for restoration. So here's a restoration 2, and then here's restoration 1. And then in between they had some areas that were unrestored. And so they're trying to compare areas they restored with areas that they did not restore. And some of the things they did in their restoration was they increased the stream length, they put in some meanders, they added some tree canopy cover, some pools and logs and boulders and gravel, vegetation, and they tried to restore some habitat. Here's what a map of this looks like. So re-meander 1 is here, and re-meander 2 is here. And then their comparison sites, the unre-meandered, were here and here. What they found in brief was kind of interesting. This is some data showing you the biomass and overall biomass and individual biomass of fish in the restored and unrestored. And restored area 1 had lots more fish, lots more biomass of fish and individual size of fish. Restored area 2 did not. It wasn't significantly any bigger. In fact, it was smaller than some of the unrestored. Don't really know why. The researchers didn't know why either. But this just goes to show you just because you build something or restore it doesn't mean it's going to come back to what it was before. That's that hysteresis idea we talked about before. So just because you restored it doesn't mean that the organisms will come back, although just downstream they did. So that's really interesting. They looked at a bunch of trophic levels here. So what sorts of fish were they getting? Piscivore, omnivore, or insectivore, or invertivore they called them. And they didn't find any real statistical differences, although there was a difference between the two restored areas and the types of gills they were getting in the fish population. What they did see is the number of reds, so REDDS, this is spawning grounds for fish. The restored areas had way more spawning grounds for fish than the unrestored areas. And that's because they had more habitat, they had more connection to riparian corridors, they had more gravel beds, and so on. So that is good to see. So you can restore streams, but that doesn't always mean that it's going to come back to the diversity it was before. There are lots of stream integrity indices out there. I gave you guys one that you could use out in the field that the Ohio EPA uses for your lab that's due next Wednesday. Here's another one that I think we've looked at in class before. This is called the IBI, the Index of Biotic Integrity. It's one of the first integrity indices that was developed. It's for fish and streams, and it looks at things like total species richness and habitat guilds and trophic guilds and abundance, and reproduction of individuals and so on, and it gives a score out of 100 to determine how well a stream is performing. Here's another one, and you certainly don't have to know all these categories, but this is one that uses invertebrates, bugs in a stream, invertebrate community index. And it looks at the number of different organisms that you have, and sensitive organisms and tolerant organisms and all that. And again, you come up with a score out of 100 and you get a ranking. So most states have maps like this that look at all the rivers in Ohio, and then it ranks them. It gives them a score, and you can see some of the Ohio's rivers were doing pretty poorly in in the 1980s, very poorly. But in 2002, most of them had recovered pretty well. Still, especially in this part of the state, you see a lot of red. You see a lot of streams that are really not performing very well. So I had you look at that website as part of your lab, that hopefully you're looking at some part of the country that has information like this, and you can click on some red streams and see why are they red, what has made them polluted or contaminated or lost habitat or low diversity, or what is it. It's not very easy to bring a habitat back once it's gone, and so we'd be far better off protecting the streams that we have to begin with. Okay, that's a very quick look at some of the problems we cause with streams and how we try to restore them.